After 4 days of failure, the Navy's top engineers still couldn't fix the ship's engine. They had tried everything. Millions were at stake. Then a retired Admiral walked in, wearing an old orange jumpsuit. One officer laughed and whispered, "This is a joke, right?" But 14 minutes later, the engine roared back to life. No one knew who he really was, and what happened next left the entire base stunned. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? The room was humming with failure, the kind that clung to egos and uniforms alike. Because for 4 days straight, the best naval engineers, dedicated technicians, and high-ranking officers had hovered over the twisted mess of titanium, brass, and precision-engineered hydraulics that powered the USS Monarch's classified propulsion core. And not one of them could fix it, not even close. The engine, an experimental multi-chamber warp hybrid drive, sat in the shipyard hangar, like a monument to embarrassment. And now the brass had brought in someone they hadn't called in over a decade. A man whose very name felt like an insult to some and a prayer to others. A man in an orange jumpsuit who walked in not like a hero returning, but like a janitor sent to clean the shame. Admiral Raymond Rust Harlan, 73 years old, beard like dry steel wool, boots like they'd walked through 3 wars and never looked back. The kind of man who didn't speak unless you were ready to be broken open and reassembled better. The second he stepped into the bay, you could feel the tension spike, like someone dropped a wrench into live current. Because behind him trailed nothing but rumors that he'd once shut down a nuclear core with chewing gum and a fork, that he'd rebuilt an aircraft carrier's turbine using parts from a vending machine, that the Pentagon quietly paid him not to talk, not to write, not to train, just to disappear after what he'd done during Operation Deepwatch. But here he was now, sleeves rolled up, staring down the same engine that had reduced every expert in the room to hand-wringing and blame-shifting. And when one of the young officers in a spotless white uniform whispered too loudly, "This is a joke, right?" everyone turned, even the engineers, as if the words were bullets and Rust was the target. But Rust didn't flinch. He just stepped closer to the engine, running a calloused hand over the complex lattice of cooling vanes, like a preacher feeling the pulse of a dying believer. Then turned to the team, not to apologize, not to ask permission, but to say 5 words that cut through the sterile room like a fuse lighting. "You logged the wrong failure code," and just like that, he stepped forward, pulling a small flashlight from his belt and popping open a side panel none of them had dared to touch, murmuring to himself like he was reading poetry while the chief engineer blinked and said, "That panel's locked for a reason," to which Rust replied, without looking up, "That's why it failed." Within minutes, he'd pulled 3 wires, twisted 2, bypassed a circuit using a quarter and a graphite pencil, then reached in barehanded to twist a pressure regulator that had been flagged as stable by a dozen diagnostics, but had a microscopic leak only a man who'd built the damn engine prototypes would recognize. And suddenly the console lit up blinking green, and the room gasped. The same officers who'd spent days drawing schematics now stood uselessly silent, As the hum of life returned to the engine bay and a low growl pulsed from the reactor chamber, like the ship herself had held her breath waiting for Rust's touch. And still, no one said thank you. Not yet. Because pride and disbelief were wrestling inside every man there. But the silence broke when the rear admiral stormed in, eyes blazing, voice demanding, who authorized this civilian to touch the monarch? And Rust, still crouched by the core, stood up slowly, wiped his hands on a rag older than the ensign beside him, and without turning said, "You did 12 years ago, when you asked me to design the system you've been pretending to understand ever since." And the room froze, the weight of truth falling like anchor chains. Because it was true. Rust wasn't just a mechanic or an admiral. They called him the ghost engineer. The last man alive who understood the full legacy architecture of the Monarch's propulsion. Because he didn't read it in a manual, he wrote the manual and burned the only copy. The young officer who'd mocked him earlier now stood with his mouth slightly open, the arrogance drained from his face, and slowly stepped back as Rust walked past, not gloating, not smiling, but carrying the same silent authority as a man who had buried friends at sea, defied orders to save lives, and lived long enough to see the world forget how much it owed him. "System stabilization holding," said one technician, barely believing his own monitor, and another added, "We're at full integrity, all chambers stable. No anomalies," and just like that. For days of chaos ended in 14 minutes of forgotten brilliance. When the rear admiral tried to reassert control by barking, "I need a full report," Rust handed him a napkin from his chest pocket with 5 handwritten steps, then walked toward the exit without waiting for permission, applause, or a thank you. But just before he reached the doors, the same skeptical officer finally called out, "Sir, who taught you all this?" And Rust paused, turned just enough to let his eyes catch the light, and said, "Experience teaches if you're willing to listen," then disappeared into the corridor, leaving behind silence, shame, and awe. As the once pristine team of experts now faced the brutal truth, they'd learned everything, but forgotten why it mattered. And while they chased titles, lectures, and AI simulations, the man in the orange jumpsuit had stayed close to the machine, to the failures, to the raw reality of fixing something not with theory, but with grit, instinct, and sacrifice. Days later, a memo would circulate at the Pentagon labeled Confidential Debrief, Incident 9X47, with a quiet note attached at the bottom. Recommend reinstatement of Admiral Harlan as Senior Advisor. Project Leviathan mission critical expertise irreplaceable. But by then, Rust would be gone again. His phone off, his tools packed, no forwarding address. Just a note left in the Monarch's control panel etched in grease pencil. When the engine coughs, check her heart first, not her numbers. And for those who'd seen him work, who'd mocked before they understood, those words would echo louder than any protocol. Because legends don't retire, they vanish, leaving behind machines that breathe better and men who finally remember why they serve.